until you obey the UN resolutions, then you shouldn't be rewarded.
It's not at all surprising to me, pressuring Seoul to try to exert pressure on its allies when it comes to sanctions.
We should not resume a cash cow to North Korea to facilitate not only their nuclear and missile programs.
Satellite imagery point to North Korea's continued production of new ballistic missiles.
It may be a negotiating tactic. The more they build, then the higher the price they want to give it up.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo urged ASEAN nations to enforce UN sanctions on North Korea. The Trump administration emphasizes it is more than a request, it is a reminder of UN obligations. Today, we take a look at how the U.S. should deal with attempts to ease sanctions on North Korea.
Those sanctions that have been tough on the North Korean government, certainly more needs to be done.
Now my guest today, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years in the intelligence community and was CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Also joining us today, Ms. Jean Lee, Director of the Korea Program at the Wilson Center. Ms. Lee is an award-winning journalist and the first Pyongyang Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Foreign ministers from the six-party talks are all gathered in the ASEAN Regional Forum, and North Korea, China, and Russia are seeking to lift sanctions on North Korea. North Korea's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho told one of the ASEAN member states that why are sanctions still not lifted when North Korea stopped weapons testing? So how should Secretary Pompeo utilize the ASEAN Forum to keep up the sanctions pressure on North Korea? If any one of you can start us off.
Well, as Secretary Pompeo rightly pointed out, is the sanctions are a requirement of all UN member nations. So the UN resolutions not only preclude North Korea from testing nuclear weapons and missiles, they also require North Korea to abandon their nuclear program, their missile program, as well as their biological and chemical warfare programs. They have not done so, and nor have they really taken any meaningful steps towards doing so. So the UN sanctions certainly are relevant to be maintained. U.S. sanctions are usually a law enforcement measure in response to North Korean illegal activity, often attacks on the U.S. financial system. So again, they're only done in response to illicit activity by North Korea. So you don't abandon your laws or your law enforcement because North Korea has done some actions which are not relevant to denuclearization.
The ASEAN Regional Forum is such an interesting place because you do have all of these countries that don't normally perhaps interact. They have the opportunity, these foreign ministers have the opportunity to sit down on the sidelines and have discussions. We'll see the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, perhaps urging his allies to stick to this campaign and to stick to UN sanctions and to adhere to them.
North Korea has been increasingly expressing frustration over sanctions through its state media. Why so? Why now? And what's its calculation?
I'm not at all surprised. I do think that North Korea will use its renewed reconciliation with South Korea to pressure Seoul to say, hey, look, are you on our side or not? You need to pressure your friends and allies to try to ease up on some of those sanctions. So we will see Pyongyang, that's not at all surprising to me, pressuring Seoul to try to exert pressure on its allies when it comes to sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think there are two very different approaches. The U.S. is saying, well, until you obey the UN resolutions, until you stop breaking U.S. laws, then you shouldn't be rewarded. North Korea depicts a very different view, in our view, putting the cart before the horse, of we want to receive benefits so that we feel less threatened. And therefore, once we North Korea, receive benefits, then we will deign to comply with UN resolutions as well as North Korea's previous commitments never to build or to then give up their nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. South Korean media reports that intelligence chief Seo Hoon visited the United States last week and met with high-level U.S. officials urging exemptions to North Korea sanctions. So is this conducive to U.S. efforts to keep up the pressure on North Korea?
Well, the South Korean view, consistent with the North Korean view, is let's prime the pump. Let's provide benefits to North Korea as a way of inducing reconciliation and lowering of tensions. The U.S. sees this as counterproductive. It's sort of, like hearing someone say, well, yes, they're still robbing banks, but let's not enforce our laws against them because they promised to turn over a new leaf. And the U.S. response would be, they're still breaking the laws. Why would we remove these laws or stop enforcing them?
We have seen some examples of exemptions in the recent past. For example, for the Winter Olympics, there were some exemptions required and requested by South Korea in order to enable the North Koreans to come to South Korea. Remember that even making a trip like that would be a violation of sanctions. So there have been some examples in the past, and I think we'll see South Korea. And I was not privy to what it was Seo Hoon asked the United States for in terms of exemptions, but we have seen the leaders of North Korea and South Korea agree, for example, to reestablish military communications. So they may be asking for exemptions related to promises that were made in Panmunjom. The danger of that, of course, is once you start going down that path of making exemptions, it chips away at the strength of the sanctions. You lose leverage, and so that's certainly a concern on the part of the United States.
What's the agenda of China and Russia when it comes to North Korea sanctions?
They have always urged reconciliation. I think they adopt sort of a value-neutral position. So when North Korea attacks or threatens South Korea, usually Beijing and Moscow will come in and say, well, can't you two Koreas get along with each other? Can't you two Koreas stop provoking each other? And so, well, it's only one North Korea that's attacking, threatening, or provoking the other, or violating UN resolutions. So they try to look beyond North Korea's actions and just urge everyone to get back to the table. And then whenever negotiations are stalled, such as during the six-party talks, they usually urge the U.S. to do something to facilitate a return to the negotiating table. So the common theme always tends to be, well, North Korea is not doing anything in the talks, so can't the U.S. offer something else, whether it's economic benefits, a reduction of sanctions, reduction of military preparedness?
On that point, North Korea has made some moves dismantling nuclear and missile engine test sites and also returning the remains of the U.S. soldiers. So should North Korea and China and Russia pressure the United States to reciprocate, how should the U.S. respond to this pressure?
I think we need to keep these actions by the North Koreans we need to put them in context. These are largely symbolic gestures. They're goodwill gestures. They're a good start to showing a commitment, but they're not concrete and they're not, I would say, substantive. Let's just remember that the nuclear tunnels can easily be reconstructed. The missile launch pad hasn't been used for those last two very threatening ICBM launches last year. So these are, I would say, symbolic gestures, but not real indications that they're dismantling their program.
Mm-hmm. President Trump yesterday received a new letter from Chairman Kim, and President Trump said, "I look forward to seeing you soon." Do you expect Chairman Kim to come to the United States around September when there's UN General Assembly?
Well, I'd love to see what the letter said, but I think there's sort of growing expectation or a sense that perhaps Kim would go to the UN General Assembly in September. He doesn't need an exemption from U.S. sanctions for that because the UN is sort of international ground. He would need an exemption to go to Washington because he's on the U.S. sanctions list for committing crimes against humanity, just as Kim Yong-chol needed an exemption to meet with President Trump in the Oval Office. So I think there's a sense that Kim may go to New York even without major progress on denuclearization. I think going to Washington would be a much different situation. I think the Trump administration would face great criticism if they allowed Kim to travel to Washington without real significant steps towards denuclearization, perhaps such as a North Korean data declaration where they provide information on their nuclear and missile programs.
Mm-hmm. Jen, what do you think? What should be the minimum progress that should be made before the second summit between North Korea and the United States?
I know that the North Koreans are not going to give up their nuclear weapons the way that the president has suggested. And so it's very difficult to say what it is we can expect from the North Koreans in terms of real action on denuclearization. I would like to see North Korea allow the return of international inspectors. IAEA inspectors have not been in North Korea since 2009. We do need somebody to really confirm that some of these actions that they're taking are real moves to dismantle that program. Also, as you mentioned, a full list of what their nuclear assets are. They're not going to provide it, but certainly something like that could be a demand.
Mm-hmm. When is the right timing to reopen the Kaesong Industrial Complex and resume tours to Mount Kumgang? Because there are reports coming out of South Korea, and North Korea is also making comments on this. So when is the right timing?
Not for quite some time. Kumgang-san was a cash cow for North Korea, and Kaesong was a 10-year economic experiment that failed. It did not induce political or economic reform as Kim Dae-jung, then president, wanted it to do. It didn't moderate North Korean behavior. It was a way for South Korea to transfer cumulatively $8 or $9 billion to the regime. Even the way it was done, the wages didn't go primarily to the workers. They got sort of pseudo currency that they could use at the company store. Most of the money went to the regime. And the South Korean government under the previous administration said the money was going to the nuclear and missile program. So we should not resume a cash cow to North Korea to facilitate not only their nuclear and missile programs, but to undermine the international pressure program.
Mm-hmm. We'll end our first discussion here and watch video for our next discussion. Latest intelligence reports and satellite imagery point to North Korea's continued production of new ballistic missiles. Since late June, U.S. media reported North Korea upgrading Yongbyon nuclear complex, running secret uranium facility Kangsan, and producing fissile material. Now, this evidence of activity at the Sanumdong missile facility, does this lead us to believe that North Korea is making progress in its missile capabilities, or does it really have to still do some testing to improve its missile capabilities?
There's disagreement amongst experts as to where exactly on the path to ICBMs and nuclear weapons and other parts of their programs that Pyongyang is. When Mike Pompeo was still CIA director in January, he said it was only a handful of months before North Korea had the ability to target the entire continental United States with nuclear weapons. 4 or 5 U.S. 4-star generals already have said they think North Korea has that capability, or we have to assume for planning purposes. So many think they have that capability. They certainly have the ability today to hit all of South Korea and Japan with nuclear weapons. There's just a bit of debate as to whether they have the ability to hit Guam and the United States with nukes, or they are very close to that capability.
This clandestine facilities, Sanumdong facility and also the uranium enrichment facility, Kangsan, they're both on the outskirts of Pyongyang. Why do you think they are so near Pyongyang?
I don't have any insight into why they're so near, but I will point out that when it comes to the most recent ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, those have been launched from mobile launchers rather than from a fixed launch pad like the one in northwest of Pyongyang that I visited in 2012. So that certainly gives them more flexibility to stay closer to Pyongyang in developing these weapons. That perhaps is one reason. But going back to your earlier point about the continued development, I don't think we should be surprised by the fact that they're keeping up this program. You know, Kim Jong-un promised not to test, but he didn't say he would stop building. So it shouldn't come as a surprise, but it's very important for us to be keeping tabs through satellite imagery from what we can see from above to see what kind of activity is going on.
Mm-hmm. But why is North Korea showing these conflicting behaviors of dismantling facilities publicly, but then keeping the clandestine ones?
Well, I think there would be different interpretations. The fact that they're covert or clandestine, right now they haven't been required to provide evidence or a listing of all their facilities. And even the continued production is not per se a violation of the Singapore agreement, because that was such a weak agreement that there really was no meat to the bones there. So North Korea is still allowed to do it under the Singapore communique. I think it goes against the spirit of the Singapore summit. It doesn't seem consistent with a government that's about to abandon all these programs. And most importantly, it's a continuing violation of 11 UN Security Council resolutions, which not only require North Korea not to test, but also to abandon all of those programs.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to remember their domestic needs as well. As far as the North Koreans are concerned, Kim Jong-un didn't get, or I should say, as far as Kim Jong-un is concerned, he didn't get what he needed to tell his people that the threat was over, and that was a peace treaty. The production of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles is a huge part of their economy right now, so they will likely continue on until they get that peace treaty or whatever assurances they need. So this is not at all surprising to me when you look at it from the perspective of the North Koreans.
Mm-hmm. Some scholars say continuing the development of weapons is a standard behavior early in the arms reduction negotiations. What are your thoughts to this kind of assertions?
Well, it may be a negotiating tactic. The more they build, then the higher the price they want to give it up. Or it may simply be a case of until there's an agreement requiring them to stop, then all the existing programs will simply continue. Again, they're not required yet under the Singapore agreement, but certainly every day that they maintain a nuclear and missile program is another violation of the resolutions.
Mm-hmm. Last question. So North Korea keeps on reneging agreements. This is North Korea's behavior in the past. How can United States have successful denuclearization negotiation with North Korea when we have this trust issue?
We need to learn from the mistakes of the past. I'd say two serious ones were in stark contrast to the arms control treaties we had with the Soviet Union. All the agreements with North Korea have been very short, very vague. The requirements were a bit, vague, so that each side could claim a different interpretation. And we had very weak verification. Arms control treaties with the Soviets, we had very lengthy, very detailed agreements. Everyone knew exactly what they had to do. And we had pretty good verification. So I think we need to do both of those with any new agreement with the North.
In addition to looking back at the history and really doing our homework, I think it's important for us to also try to understand the way that the North Koreans think. And we're not going to be able to deal with them unless we understand what it is they want. And I think there's a lack of understanding of what their objectives are. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration as well. Not to give in to them completely, but to understand how to come up with a strategy on meeting your own interests.
We'll end this discussion here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today is North Korea's national carrier Air Koryo's new in-flight meal, a vegetarian burger. Now, Air Koryo's hamburger features in countless social media feeds, most of which are now complimentary. Will the new vegetarian burger also become so famous? We got this picture from Korea Tour's blog, and inserted next to it a vegetarian burger we typically see here in America with meat alternative. Bruce, what's your reaction?
I'd want the real hamburger version. I don't know if it means that Kim Jong-un and the rest of North Korea are going vegan or not, or whether you try to perhaps overinterpret and say that they're providing a meatless version because they don't have enough meat for their own citizens or even on their airlines.
Jean?
Just vegetables.
Yeah.
I've been on many, many, many Air Koryo flights, and I usually don't eat the mystery meat. And so I will probably be more inclined to eat this, but I would much rather that they do something Korean.
Jean?
We'll suggest it to them.
Jean, Bruce, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.